Good evening. I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lecture Series for 2023. And now it's my great honor to introduce the University of Chicago President, Paul Alivisatos, who will discuss the history and relevance of our wonderful annual Berlin Family Lectures. Paul became the 14th president of the University of Chicago in 2021. And in addition to his role as president, Paul is the John D. MacArthur Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Chemistry. A native of Chicago, Paul is also a University of Chicago graduate, having received his bachelor's degree in 1981. He distinctly remembers and fondly talks about his courses in the Humanities Division and has often said that he applies the critical thinking skills that he learned every day to his scientific and administrative work. His admiration for the value of the humanities makes him the ideal person to discuss the Berlin Family Lectures. And now I'm honored to turn the podium over to our esteemed president, Paul Alivisatos.
Thank you, Dean Robertson, and indeed, that is all very true. Welcome all to this year's Berlin Family Lectures. These lectures were established in 2014 by Randy Berlin and her late husband, Melvin. Each year, this lecture brings to our community one of the world's greatest scholars of the arts, humanities, and humanistic social sciences. Our society at large and our university community alike have a need to engage with the humanistic lens of thought more deeply than ever. Dean Robertson mentioned a moment ago how much the humanities here at the University of Chicago has changed my life in so many deep ways and continues to do so each day. But I would say in the intervening years, in the midst of the immense technological transformations that are going on around us, in the midst of enormous geopolitical challenges, when we are grappling with deep societal challenges around inclusion, democracy, authoritarianism, so many other issues that surround identities and more, the questions of what it means to be human in this period, the humanistic lens of thought has become central and deeper to so much of all of our lives and to so much of what will happen in our future. This year's Berlin Family Lecturer, Mary Beard, is a deep scholar of the classics and of the world of the Romans, but she is also a person who is deeply gifted in bringing this work into the public discourse and sharing it with the public. She is indeed the model of an engaged humanist. I had the joy last night, as I was studying for this, to read a few of your interviews, but also to watch one of your marvelous programs, which was about the world of how in Roman times, how citizenship was conceived. What a deep issue that we reflect on at this time in our society and globally, and the ways in which you were able to bring that history into the present set of decisions and what we live in as a society felt so deep to me. So I do think that today, for this series, we're really beyond fortunate to have Mary Beard here to be our lecturer. And I want to welcome you to the University of Chicago and to say how much it means to us that you have come to spend this time with us and to reflect with us on how classics will teach us about the world we live in today. Dean Robertson, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, President Alivisatos, for recognizing the importance of the Berlin Family Lectures to our community. Now, before I introduce tonight's Berlin Family Lecturer, let me briefly mention the Berlin Lectures for 2024. The prize-winning novelist and short story writer Yi-Yun Lee, known for her powerful distillations of personal grief in books such as 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, Where Reasons End, and Must I Go, Lee is professor of creative writing at Princeton University. I invite you all here today to join us in 2024 and each year thereafter for a lecture series that continually discovers new ideas and delivers fresh perspectives about our human condition. Now tonight, we have the distinct honor of listening to and asking questions of Mary Beard. She's an award-winning classicist, original thinker, and influential feminist, well known in both the classroom and on the BBC. Her broadcasting career took off in her mid-50s when Mary smashed through boundaries of gender and even of appearance for learned commentators when she herself called herself a craggy white woman, working in the midst of what she describes as craggy white men. In hosting a series of BBC programs that reveal her candor, her knowledge of the ancient world, and her original insights, Mary has become one of Great Britain's best known and most beloved academics. Her fame has surpassed national boundaries and grown into worldwide admiration and respect. After teaching for more than 40 years, Mary is Professor Emerita in Classics at Newnham College at the University of Cambridge. She continues her research and writing and serves as the classics editor for the Times Literary Supplement, where Mary writes a frequent blog called A Don's Life. In 2018, Mary was named Dame Commander of the British Empire for her services to the study of classical civilizations. Among her many honors, she received the Wolfson History Prize for her book, Pompeii, The Life of a Roman Town, the Bodley Medal for her outstanding contributions to the world of books, and honorary degrees from Oxford University, Yale University, the University of St. Andrews, among others. In these Berlin Family Lectures, Mary challenges several of our assumptions about the classics. She contends that the ancient world does not offer ready-made answers to our modern dilemmas. In exploring the fun, the dangers, and the heady uncertainties that the classics bring, Mary nonetheless contends that study of this fundamental and time-honored subject can help us think differently, look at the world with new eyes, and understand better where our own assumptions come from. Now, Mary launches the series of 3 lectures by focusing the first one on a piece of cake. And I'm not speaking here of the expression, but rather about an actual 3,000-year-old carbonized cake from Egypt that was her first encounter with the ancient world and the wonderment it instilled. This one small object, perhaps once a delicacy, launched as a series of questions about what classics is and the contests over its definition that go back centuries. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Mary's entry into the field as a classics major at university. And she uses this occasion partly as an opportunity to reflect on what has changed over the last half century and how differently she approaches that piece of cake now. I know that Mary Beard will enlighten and I suspect entertain us with new insights in her 3 lectures as she explores her theme about what can we learn from the classics. Please give a warm welcome to this year's Berlin Family Lecturer, Mary Beard.
Thank you very much, Anne. If people are wondering what we were whispering about, it was only that I managed to find my telephone, which I had lost before. Okay. I would like very much to thank everybody here, the Berlin family for making these lectures possible, everybody at the University of Chicago who has been just wonderful in getting all this together, and for the honor of the invitation. And to everybody who's turned up to listen, and if you're looking at this remotely, you're very welcome too. It's also been a privilege to have the opportunity to, and it's been quite difficult as well, to have the opportunity to think about classics and classics as a discipline and as a profession in a different way. I think many people here will probably know that currently there are enormous numbers of disputes within the subject, disagreements within the subject about what it is, who should do it, who's in charge, and there always have been. Inevitably, in what happens in the next few lectures, I shall be engaging with some of those disputes, but I'm trying to take a different perspective, and in some senses, a kind of more personal perspective. I apologize for the kind of bits of autobiography that are going to crop up, particularly today. But I'm interested in thinking about some of the questions that we don't usually think about, like what on earth does it mean to make your job out of the Greeks and Romans? And that's one of the things that I'm going to be broaching now and for the rest of the series. But I'm going to start this lecture back with the piece of cake. In 1960, when I was just 5, and amazingly, now you can know exactly how old I am now, and I was living in a remote village on the English-Welsh border, and my mum was the village schoolmistress. And she decided when I was 5, it was time for me to see some of the sights of London. So off we went, and we made a beeline for, among some rather more frivolous places, I should say, the British Museum. And there, I wanted to see some of the stuff from ancient Egypt. The mummies, of course, but also what went under the rather more austere heading of the remains of everyday life in ancient Egypt. This was 60 years ago, remember, and museums then were not anything like as child-friendly as they are now. The display cases were awfully high, and they were too high for a little kid to see inside. But when my mum spotted what she said was, I think it's now gone up to a 4,000-year-old piece of Egyptian cake, which actually I think was probably this piece of bread that you see on screen now, I demanded that she pick me up for a proper look. Now, this wasn't at all easy, because our target, the bread or the cake, was at the very back of the case. And I was heavy and very wriggly, and we had our luggage with us. So things were not going well, right? When a man passed by and asked, what was I trying to look at? That piece of cake, I said, by now more than a bit desperate. He must have been a curator, for he reached into his pocket, pulled out a large bunch of keys, opened the case, extracted the cake or the bread or whatever, and held it in front of me, a couple of inches from my nose. Now, I can't begin to capture for you the excitement of that moment, eyeball to eyeball, with such an everyday consumable made by and for people unimaginably distant from me. What did it feel like to be quite so close to the past, to be allowed a tantalizing glimpse of that mysterious other world through something as ordinary as a piece of cake? It was in its little way, a thunderbolt. It's what the ancient Greeks would have called a thauma, a wonder in many senses of that complicated word, a thing that knocks you out, that amazes, but also a puzzle that engages the brain and makes you wonder, quite literally, about what it is and how to make sense of it. For both Plato and Aristotle, it was thauma that kick-started philosophy. Now, I shall be coming back at the very end of this lecture to the man with the key, the heroic man with the key. I promise you, he won't be forgotten. But as for me, that little piece of cake kick-started a lasting curiosity and wonderment about the ancient world. I learned Latin and Greek at high school. I majored in classics at university, specialising in ancient literature, history, and archaeology. I wrote a doctoral thesis on ancient Roman religion, and then classics became my day job as a professor until I retired last year. Now, that summary may make it all sound a bit effortless, but I can promise you it was not effortless, right? Like most people, I guess, I have plenty of academic skeletons in my cupboard. There are books I've started writing but never finished. There's errors I've made, not only factual, and there are academic battles that I now think that when I was young, I fought rather too fiercely and probably unkindly. I can assure you that the theory wars in the 1970s and 80s can make the culture wars of the 21st century look like polite skirmishes, right? So think on that, right? And I've had to struggle really hard to learn how to interest other people in the ancient world. I shall always be grateful to a senior colleague who, when I must have been, I suppose, in my late 20s, sat me down to lunch with a pizza and a large bottle of wine, and when the bottle was nearly empty, nerved himself to tell me that what I was writing was probably true, but actually a bit dull. I'll tell you who it was later if you ask. Some of you have guessed already. I didn't feel grateful at the time. Nobody likes very much to be told that they're boring. But it was some of the most useful criticism I've ever had in my life. I've also had personal tussles to find a place for myself within professional classics, and to recognise and to manage my own contradictions about that, political and otherwise. I realise that when you get to my position, and in particular to my age, you can easily appear from the outside as if you've always fitted in to your subject of choice. You look as if you've always belonged, almost a kind of self-confident traditionalist. For most of us, that is simply not true, and it has never been so. Take a quick look in passing at this rogues gallery of old white British and Irish male classicists that I've just put on the screen. I shall be drawing on a few of them today and later in this series. For now, let me simply say that although images such as these have become for us the symbols of a hidebound past, of exclusivity, of discrimination, and of an approach to classics that we really want to throw over, rightly in many ways, every single one of these blokes was conflicted, anxious, and uncertain. And in their own terms, they were all revolutionaries. They don't look like it, But they were changing what the subject of classics was all about. They were attempting to redefine what and who it was for. There were even some proto-social justice warriors among them, believe it or not. It's perhaps worth remembering that one of the most influential attacks on slavery and the slave trade in England was written by the classic student Thomas Clarkson in 1785. You can see him slightly larger here. He wrote this attack as an entry to a Latin essay competition where the question set for the students to answer by an abolitionist vice-chancellor was, is it right to enslave people against their will? The point I'm making is not so much that Clarkson was on the side of the angels, it is the medium of the essay written in Latin, usually taken to be one of the most fetishized and pointless exercises in the British classical curriculum, beaten only by writing Latin poetry, was here conscripted to a social justice cause. I put on the right, just as an antidote to the old white blokes previously, the bust of Thomas Clarkson being feted on television by the British poet Benjamin Zephaniah. I feel I ought to say, by the way, it became an extremely influential tract, but only after it was translated back into English. Right? Now, I myself can barely remember a time when I didn't have my own conflicts, really about how I thought of myself as a classicist. Just a decade or so after that cake moment, I was navigating a strangely split teenage existence. In my head, I was a free-thinking revolutionary, right? While in day-to-day real life, I was decidedly unrevolutionary. I was a swot who was diligently learning her Latin and Greek grammar. I now kind of think of this as a kind of Rosa Luxemburg meets Goody Two-Shoes. But to most onlookers, I suspect it was more Two-Shoes than Luxemburg, sadly. I don't know if I knew which of those was more me, but my powerful symbolic memory is of doing my school homework at our kitchen table, obediently drumming into my head 2 dead languages with preposterously irregular verbs, while purposefully sitting under a poster of Angela Davis, who was then in prison, that my parents had allowed me to stick up in the kitchen. I think I face up to that kind of contradiction a bit better now, a bit more openly at least. But I don't think that I've resolved that entirely. Nor perhaps is it something that I would want entirely to resolve. Up to a point, not fitting in or living with contradictions is quite a good idea, and something that in the 20th century we might try to embrace more. Though of course, I also realise that it is usually those of us who are actually insiders who have the luxury of celebrating the pleasures of being an outsider. Not fitting in is only a pleasure if at some level you do fit in. I should say, by the way, that thanks to the magic of Google Images, I managed to find this picture of the very same poster that I had up in the kitchen all those years ago. I was absolutely delighted when I spotted it. I was a bit less delighted to discover that it's actually from a museum now. Anyway, 50 years from the time that I first became a full-time classics student at university in 1973, that's 13 years after the cake, makes this a good time for me to take stock more generally, to think what the ancient world has to offer, which bit of it, and why and how it still matters. That's what, in their different ways, these 3 lectures aim to do. I'll be trying to range widely, giving walk-on parts to predictable and unpredictable characters, both ancient and modern. You've already seen the Rogues Gallery, but you will also be connecting or reconnecting briefly with Alexander Crummell and Franklin D. Roosevelt and family at a toga party, with the Emperor Commodus and Antonio Gramsci. Now, that's my favorite unlikely pairing, because we never realized how Joaquin Phoenix was a spitting image of Gramsci, did he? Huh? Really is. We'll have Medea and Jane Ellen Harrison, if I can squeeze her in, plus Hitler and Mussolini. What you're actually looking at on screen now is a famous image of Hitler's visit to the monuments of Rome in 1938 that I'll be returning to when I talk about questions of power and ethics, fear and loathing in my last lecture, though you'll perhaps be pleased to know that I'm most interested in the man in the centre, the man conscripted to be their tour guide, Ranuccio Bianchi Bandinelli, in the centre there, and often quietly overlooked in this photograph, the man who went on to be the most influential Marxist classical archaeologist of modern Italy, if not Europe. There's a meeting of politics in that picture. Next time, I will be dropping in briefly on the crisis of the humanities. The classics, in a sense, is humanities in its most extreme form. Asking straight what classics teaches us, what and who it is for, and whether, for example, we should be expanding its disciplinary boundaries, while sketching out a bit of a manifesto for classics in the future. But today, I hope you don't mind if, as I said, I explore some rather more personal reflections on classics as I have lived with it, and on the conventional definitions of it that I grew up with. What have I found so exciting about the subject that I have stuck with it for more than half a century? How do I explain to myself why I've spent my life and earned my living with a load of old Greeks and Romans who have been dead for 2 millennia and whose languages no one now speaks, apart, I suppose I should say, from a few guys in the Pope's PR department and some dotty enthusiasts who occasionally broadcast the news in Latin, a project as harmless as it is pointless, I think I should say. What kind of experience has it been trying to understand the ancient world? And that's, I think, a difficult question. At the end, I'll be nibbling at some of the contradictions that lie at the heart of classics by making a return visit to the British Museum and to the Egyptian galleries, a visit, let me warn you, with a much less happy outcome. You'll probably have guessed that Thauma, in its different senses, has remained a significant part of my experience of the ancient world. It's true that for some of my professional career, any such wonderment was pretty much drummed out of me as if it was somehow sentimental, naive, or incompatible with scholarly academic rigour. I can tell you it isn't. But I'm pleased to say I've got some of the Thauma back again, and that is partly what I'm wanting to share with you. I'm going to come clean at this point and admit that personally, I have never really thrilled, and I mean thrilled, to the greatest hits of classical culture, whether drama or philosophy, history or sculpture, like the bit of the Ara Pacis you see Mussolini dutifully looking at here. To put it bluntly, if I found my excitement in the classical world waning, I wouldn't curl up with a few volumes of Livy or Aristotle's Categories. I have friends and colleagues who would do that. Some of them, I think, might be here this evening. And I should say that I've learned loads from them, from their expertise, their enthusiasm, their spark, in my own understanding of those texts and works of art. But the bottom line is that kind of stuff is not, it's not me. It is for me, but it's not me. To be sure, I really think that many of those greatest hits of classical culture are endlessly worth discussing, endlessly interesting. I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that the world would be a poorer place if we didn't have Euripides' 5th century tragedy Medea and all the moral questions that it raises still about a heroine who murders her own children to take revenge on her faithless slimebag husband. And if anybody knows a more sharp or succinct denunciation of imperialism than Tacitus's brilliant slogan about himself and his fellow Romans, they make a desert and they call it peace, then please tell me, because I don't know of a better one. I'll be coming back to some of those interesting things next time, but I would be lying if I said that they constituted my spark. If we're talking light bulb moments, it hasn't been them, all right? I should perhaps add now that I've always also felt resistant to the idea, an idea that still lingers in some corners and may even be having a comeback, that I somehow should admire, or at least I should pretend to admire, the glories of classical civilization. I think the subject of classics would be better off without that kind of ideological baggage. And I have a soft spot for the young man who takes a cameo role at the start of E.R. Dodds's famous book, The Greeks and the Irrational. You'll recognise Dodds from my lineup of old men. In the book, this young man comes up to Dodds, the author, so he tells us, in front of the Parthenon marbles, and blurts, "I know it's an awful thing to confess, but this Greek stuff doesn't move me at all," right? Brave thing to do. I actually half suspect that he was not a real young man at all, but the guilty alter ego of Dodds himself, who was nothing if not conflicted about his own relationship to classics, but that's another matter. In a similar spirit, I squirm at some of the language conventionally used to talk about Greece and Rome. You know, miracle, originary, or my particular pet hate, the phrase great general, as in Julius Caesar was a great general, right? Which from the other side of the spear would be best translated as bloodthirsty butcher, right? And you won't be surprised that I'm very uncomfortable too with the narrative of Western civilization sprung from the Greeks that underpins this admiration. A narrative that is at best self-serving and misleading, at worst exploitative, imperialist and racist, and which ironically seems to have infiltrated the cover design of this most recent edition by University of California Press of Dodds's great book. Dodds would be horrified if he saw this cover. I don't want also, or either, to get stuck into this question now, because it's a very sticky question to get stuck into. But just for the record, my own version of Western civilization is not a golden thread, or in Appier's nice formulation, a golden nugget passed from one cultural high spot in the West to the next. Like all civilizations, it's a messy, tangled, hybrid, contested, contradictory, straggly, and sometimes self-deceiving knot, in which, however, Greco-Roman traditions are inextricably embedded and have not the special part to play. There hasn't, after all, been a single day since Virgil dropped his pen and keeled over in 19 BCE when someone somewhere hasn't been reading the Aeneid, whether that's Dante, Ralph Ellison, or Shardy Barch, right? Or whoever, right? And that points to what I mean by special. Anyway, I'm happy to come back to all this in the discussion if you want, but right now I'm parking it and returning to the main question. What has been for me the thrill and the spark if it hasn't been these greatest hits? Quite simply, what's really excited me over the years has been the messy, bodily, seedy, ordinary, day-to-day, dirty side of the classical past, unforgettably so. It is the thauma, the wonderment of the completely ordinary. That's my thrill, though it will turn out to be a bit more complicated than that might make it seem. Let me start to give you an idea of how you might capture it in a Roman bar. On the screen now is the first of 2 strip cartoons that are going to feature this evening. This one is my absolute favourite painting from the walls of Pompeii. It decorated the inside room of one of the town's drinking dens, cafes, and fast food joints. Not an impressive sight now. You've got the bar counter at the front onto the street. The cartoon was painted on the wall of the room at the back. Now, this isn't classical painting with all the hushed hype of a masterpiece, nor is it the stereotypical white toga-clad Romans lying down, consuming grapes and dormice. That was probably no more common in reality in the Roman world than tuxedo-clad dinners are in our own. These are men and women sitting upright at the bar tables, brightly dressed, drinking, gambling, getting off with one another, fighting, talking bar talk, and sometimes being extremely rude. It is as if we are at the bar, and these Romans are behaving like ordinary Romans behaved there. There is a little narrative of sorts in the sequence of events, with sound bites written above in street talk, Latin street talk. The first shows a man and a woman, well, probably, I think, a man and a woman, having a snog. And he is saying, "I don't want to with Myrtalis," meaning, I guess, though it's a bit unclear, I'm glad I'm doing it with you, not her. The next features a couple of guys sitting down with a server bringing some drinks. Things are beginning to hot up a little. One of the guys is saying, "Hey, over here," while the other is saying, "No, it's mine." While the server responds, "For heaven's sake, whoever wants it, take it. Oceanus, it's yours if you want it." Third scene takes another couple, on the brink now of a full-scale row over the gaming board. "I won, no you didn't, it was a 2, not a 3. And they are still there at the final scene and still arguing about the 2 and the 3 while calling each other very rude names. I don't think I need to translate, right? The long-suffering bar owner is understandably saying, "Guys, if you're going to fight, take it outside," right? What you have then, as I said, is an image of life in the Roman bar, painted on its own walls, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a joke, probably a bit of both, but certainly as a kind of mirror for the customers in the bar. And thanks to the tragedy of the eruption, we feel we now can take a snoop and put ourselves in their place and sort of see ourselves in that mirror. There's a similar feeling, I think, with the stepping stones over the streets at Pompeii, a Roman convenience put there to help people cross the road when heavy rain turned the streets into rivers, like it still does, probably also to help them avoid the less savoury bits of garbage that was in the street. If you go to Pompeii today and look for where people get their photographs taken, and that's always a good sign of what particularly interests them, the absolute prime location is on the stepping stones, whether they're professors, tourists, students, or whatever. Why? Because I think it is one place where we can confidently put our feet exactly where the Romans trod. We can reenact their steps, we can take the same path. It's partly about imagining how to see ourselves in their place. But this isn't just about Pompeii, and it's not just about archaeology. Lurking in all kinds of unexpected contexts in classical literature, greatest hits or otherwise, are some similarly vivid encounters we feel we can have with the human beings of the past. And I certainly have felt I could. Another favourite example of mine is something as ordinary and as unremarkable as an ancient human laugh. This time we're in 192 CE, more than 100 years after Pompeii was destroyed, and we're in the Colosseum. The Emperor Commodus is presiding over a series of bloody spectacles. But he's not just presiding. As we know from the movie Gladiator and elsewhere, Commodus, seen here sadly without Gramsci, was a keen performer in the gladiatorial arena and an eager slaughterer of unfortunate wild beasts. At one notorious moment in the course of the events, he had severed the head of a poor ostrich. It had all been carefully arranged so as to be absolutely risk-free for the emperor. Not for the ostrich, for the emperor. And he had then walked over to where the senators were sitting on the front row, brandishing the bird's head in one hand and a sword in the other, saying nothing but grinning, right? As if to indicate, you lot next. We know all this from the historian Cassius Dio, who was one of those senators on the front row. Dio explains in his account that the immediate reaction of most of them was to giggle, right? But realizing that that would very likely be a fatal error, and possibly, literally fatal error, Dio had the bright idea of taking a laurel leaf from the wreath that he was wearing, because everybody dresses up posh in the Colosseum. It's more like going to the opera than going to a wrestling match. He took a leaf from the wreath he was wearing, and he chewed on it to stop the laughter and save his skin, right? Now, I think we can all at least half recognize Dio's dilemma here, and at least half put ourselves in that hot spot on the front row facing Commodus. It's not so far different from that familiar moment in, say, the classroom at high school when the teacher is about to look a real fool. He's going to tread in a great pile of dog shit or something. But you can't let yourself laugh for fear of the punishment that would be bound to follow. So what do? You bite really hard on your finger or on a ruler to keep it in. It was precisely that reaction when I first read this account that I could almost feel and share across 2,000 years. It was as if, through the bodily discomfort of Dio's suppressed laugh, that I could be in the Colosseum too. I could be looking Commodus in the eye, and it felt like heady stuff. It's wonderful, it's great. But I hope I'm not now going to disappoint you if I say that my excitement at these glimpses of the past through 2 millennia is not quite what it might seem. For it doesn't take a hard-headed academic to point out that despite the way I've been telling the stories, that gap between antiquity and us doesn't ever quite close. If you look carefully, for example, at what Dio's Greek, for he was writing in Greek, actually says, he almost says what I've quoted him as saying, but not quite. Dio, interestingly, doesn't go out biting on the damn leaf in our kind of classroom way to prevent laughter. What he actually does, if you look at what he really says, is he refers to chewing on the leaf so that, and I'm quoting him here, the continual movement of my jaws might conceal the signs of laughter. Now that is not the same thing at all, and it isn't quite us. And those who chose to read the Latin in the strip cartoon that I put on will also have spotted that I had to massage the language quite a bit to give it any kind of immediacy. And anyway, that painting is no longer in the bar, acting as a mirror for the customers. It's in the museum at Naples. It's been carefully touched up in sanitized isolation and is only handled by people wearing latex blue gloves, right? If you want to get me started on a good rant, ask me about my views on the blue glovification of our relationship with the past, but that's another story. Meanwhile, the bar itself that we saw has been heavily restored, and it's in the middle of a Roman town, which is itself, let's be honest, 80% reconstruction. It's easy to forget that ancient Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano, and we have rebuilt it, right? Now, I have to say, go to the Pompeii show at the Museum of Science and Industry yesterday, because I partly wanted to see if by any chance they'd actually brought this painting that I was talking about from Italy, and they hadn't. They did have an awful lot of plaster casts of apparently the vacuums left by the dead bodies. At the risk of being a terrible party pooper, I want to say that they too are also very largely constructions of the modern world, right? And I can explain what I mean by that if you want to know. But for me, that's not really the disappointment. That isn't a disappointment, actually. In a way, it's that gap where the Thauma and the wonderment and the bafflement and the puzzlement now lies. Now, of course, there is still a wow factor. I am going to take that bar to my grave with that image of those guys quarrelling. But it's also, and more, what's getting me, I think, is the fragility, the sheer fragility of that enticing familiarity. And in the utterly hard to get your head around problems and queries and questions that fragility opens up. Often magnified, I think, and easier to see in the ordinary and the micro than in the great and the grand. Kind of questions like, what is our access to the people of the past? What processes of intervention or interpretation police that access? What links us with those dead people? What separates us from them? How fragile is the apparent familiarity? How do you start to work out what human beings have in common as human beings across that timescale? What will our present look like 2,000 years into the future? Of course, there are other ways of approaching those problems, but for me, this is the one that acts best, and it's what sparks me. I think that it is also in the minds of at least some of those people immortalising themselves as they walk across the stepping stones at Pompeii, which for the most part are not reconstructions, let me assure you. Okay, some of those people may be simply engaged in imaginary time travel, pretending to be Romans, having a bit of a laugh. Others, I strongly suspect, and I say this on the basis of some lengthy surreptitious observation, others are actually wondering about what they're doing, how far they're stepping into ancient footsteps, and what that would mean. I think that, like a lot of things that get written off as cheap tourist activities, what's going on here is rather more reflective than it might at first sight appear. It's not so much kind of, wow, we're being Romans, but what is our experience doing to us to put them with them or not? More obviously reflective are the words on precisely this theme of another figure from my rogues gallery that I want to use to sum up this section before finishing with another child in front of a museum case. This is the Irish poet and classicist Louis MacNeice, born in 1907. He was a university lecturer both in the UK and for a while at Cornell in the 1930s, before giving up teaching to work largely for BBC Radio and largely producing classical items for the BBC. MacNeice is in many ways a puzzling figure. He's a bit aloof, a pretty hopeless lecturer, and personally very high maintenance as far as we can see. His friend and contemporary, Anthony Blunt, the art historian and Soviet spy, called him irredeemably heterosexual, which starts to fill the picture out a bit, I think. It was actually partly the high-maintenance, irredeemable heterosexuality that caused him to leave Cornell and come back to London to work for the BBC. But in the course of a long autobiographical poem called Autumn Journal, written almost 100 years ago now and published in 1938, he gives one of the best accounts ever written of what it is to be both engaged with and disengaged from classics, and it's really well worth reading, especially if you're in the game. I want to quote you part of it, where he is wondering about what really interests him in the ancient world. It is not the glories of Greece, Hellas as he calls it, nor what I've called the greatest hits, but like me, the real-life people and the underbelly of antiquity. When I should remember the paragons of Hellas, he said, I think instead of the crooks, the adventurers, the opportunists, the careless athlete and the fancy boys, the hair-splitters, the pedants, the hard-boiled skeptics, and the agora, and the noise of the demagogues and the quacks, and the women pouring libations over graves, and the trimmers at Delphi and the dummies at Sparta, and lastly, I think of the slaves. And how one can imagine oneself among them, I do not know. It was all so unimaginably different and all so long ago. Now, what's important about this is not just that it's a pretty fair analogue of my own cast of characters, giggling senators, gamblers and drunks. And it certainly chimed with me when I first read it as a student, because Moses Finley was then teaching the first full-on course on ancient slavery we had ever had in Cambridge, and was raising precisely this issue of who we should be interested in the ancient world. But what's also important is that MacNeice homes in here on the tantalising, frustrating allure of the lived experience of those ordinary people in antiquity. The glimpse we almost get, but not quite. The so near yet so farness of it all. How can one imagine oneself among them? I do not know. It was all so unimaginably different and all so long ago. And unimaginably, in the absolutely literal sense, it is impossible to imagine it. Now, for me too, those have been the questions that classics has sparked, and those are the questions that have sparked my interest in the ancient world. And I think MacNeice puts it better than anybody. But I want to end now back in the British Museum, but with a very different version of a child's encounter with the ancient Egyptians there, and it is not a nice story. We might call it Fauma Thwarted. It's It's another strip cartoon, without words this time, and published in Punch magazine in 1916. It's by a famous British cartoonist, H.M. Bateman, who often appeared in the US too, and it's called The Boy Who Breathed on the Glass at the British Museum. The story is a simple one, and I'll break it down into easier scenes. A young boy, working-class kid, with his distinctive flat cap, cheeky chappy, is going to visit the mummies in the museum. But as he gets right up close to the glass of the case and breathes on it and apparently starts to draw with his finger, up rushes a security guard, carries him off and hands him over to the police. The next we see of him, he's in a police cell and then in court, where the judge hands down a long prison sentence. Hard labour until he is an old man. When he's eventually released, what does he then do? He goes straight back to the British Museum, he breathes on the glass again and falls straight down dead. Now, I cannot confess fully to understand this cartoon. It goes without saying that it is a wild exaggeration, but is not a complete fantasy. When I talked about this on Twitter last week, the folks at Oldham Museum in the north of England sent me this roughly contemporary notice, the extract from the rules and regulations of their museum, this is handed down nationally, which does threaten malefactors in the museum with hard labour, or if they are under 16, whipping, right? This is where you feel like Louis McNeice and things being unimaginably different, whipping kids for doing something naughty in a museum. But it was, I should say, hard labour only for up to 6 months, right? Not the lifetime that Bateman imagined. The Oldham Museum, when they gave me this picture, did ask me to say, which I will now, that they are much more welcoming now, which I can positively attest. But it's still odd. The cartoon is not at all typical of Bateman's work, which was very popular through the first half of the 20th century. And in fact, he produced a whole series of cartoons entitled The Man Who, The Woman Who, The Boy Who. But they're not usually as sinister as this. Normally, they take a pot shot at a dim aristocrat or a harmless upstart for breaking the rules of etiquette. This is very typical. The man who threw a snowball at Samoritz. Oh my God, right? But I find it difficult to put The Boy Who Breathed on the Glass into that category of that series of cartoons. I see him very clearly as working class, though I worry about that, because when he says goodbye to mum and dad before going off to prison, mum and dad do look decidedly posher than him, and dad appears to have a top hat. So I may be getting this wrong. And if you thought that Bateman must have been an enemy of the British Museum to do this cartoon, I don't think there's any sign of that. In fact, he gave the British Museum the original drawing as a kind of act of generosity. They still have it, lovingly cared for. I should say also that I struggled for a while with the first subtitle of the story in Punch. Subtitles changed a bit later in the reprints. The first one was called An Antebellum Tragedy. Now, it's partly because I was going to give this lecture here that I thought there has to be some reference to the American Civil War in this. But what is there? Is there a reference to race or something connected with it? I struggled forever. But again, thanks to sharing my problems on Twitter, I discovered that the British Museum was closed by the government in early 1916, the time when this cartoon was produced, and almost certainly all Bateman is doing is saying, you have to imagine this as taking place antebellum, before the war, before the First World War, when the BM was still open. But But still, what's the point of it? The basic point must be some kind of pre-Foucauldian attempt to investigate the museum as a Foucauldian apparatus of power, mustn't it, right? The glass breathing being the most trivial bit of rule breaking, but even that was punished with the full arm of the law. But in the context of my theme today and in this series of lectures, I think it has to be more specifically about exclusion, about who doesn't get let into the ancient world, classical, Egyptian, or whatever. In this instance, the kid won't be put off, but it kills him. Now, in some ways, I find, this is perhaps a bit self-obsessed, but I find the cartoon stands as a kind of partly deserved rebuke to myself. I gave you, after all, a slightly saccharine version of my first trip to antiquity in the British Museum. And however much I shall continue to see myself as an outsider in classics, as well as an insider in the study of antiquity, it's clear that my face fitted where the boy's face didn't fit. He went on, put it crudely, to hard labour in prison, whereas I went on to diligent swatting with a prisoner as decoration on my wall. And that's an uncomfortable contrast, I think, in that. But to let myself off the hook a little to finish, the difference really comes down to the curator passing with his keys. I could have been that boy, I might almost have been that boy, I might well have blown on the glass and written my name, but for the man who opened the case. And in fact, ultimately, when I think back to the Thalma of that experience, when I was 5 in the BM, what struck me was not only the wonder of the cake, but also the wonder of having the glass opened for me, the wonder of having someone who was prepared to open the glass for me. Cases are, after all, made to be opened, not glass to be breathed on. And my hope is that I have taken the lesson of that seriously, and literally or metaphorically, I've done my bit in opening them. And I know there are many people here who also have done their bit. The discipline of classics stands for anything for me. It stands for wonder, for the impossibility of understanding, for the intellectual roller coaster, and for a commitment to sharing it. It's that curator who's the key to it all, and that he is the lesson that we should take out of the story, and the implied demand that we, people in my position, should always try to be more like the curator. Now, I'll continue some of this next time when I shall have some more celebrations of classics to do, but I shall also be returning to the image of the boy and what it's like to be excluded from a subject to which I feel committed. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary Beard, for really a magnificent lecture. I think I'm probably not the only researcher in this audience who had to raise their hand and swear not to burn the books in the Bodleian. Yes.
And it always makes you want to, doesn't it? There's something, when you have to promise not to, you always start to imagine. You know, it turns me into a pyromaniac.
It is, yes. All right, well, now I invite you, the audience here in Friedman Hall and online, to ask your questions of Mary. And we'll begin with the audience here. If you will raise your hand and then wait for the microphone to come. We have our servers positioned here, and they'll move quickly.
While we're waiting for the mic, I will add something to this pyromaniac story that I did once write in a blog that somehow I could understand what it would be like to want to burn the Alexandrian Library down. And someone actually absolutely pointedly wrote back and said, only someone who lived next door to the University Library in Cambridge would ever have the nerve to write that. And that goes back to what I'm saying. It's only those who are sort of really insiders who kind of enjoy flirting with the idea of being outsiders in this subject. Anyway, sorry, that was...
All right, yes. Michelle, and we'll wait. Here we come.
Thank you so much. I'm Michelle Lowry. I'm a classicist, for those who don't know. And I was very entertained as well as moved by your stories. There is something that people say about the humanities that makes me cringe, but I also think is somewhat important, and I'm wondering what your take on it is, which is that one of the things we're supposed to learn in humanities courses is empathy. And I mean, you see why I'm asking, because there is some kind of relationship to these things that are so far away. And I really don't want to describe it as empathy, but I think maybe I'm wrong.
I'd like to think this is what our one-time Prime Minister Boris Johnson was always telling us: we could have our cake and eat it, that I'm never going to get rid of it. There's part of me is always going to be in that bloody bar, well, being the serving woman, actually, with these rowdy guys. And I really resist anyone just taking that away from me and saying, no, you can't. I worry about identifying with them, but empathy, kind of feeling what it might have been like to be there, I treasure that. But I think what makes that treasuring actually more piquant and more edgy is knowing it can't be right. I'm not in that damn bar. I don't know what they're feeling like. I can't be them at all. And it's somehow that balance of, there I am, I'm trying not to laugh, and Commodus is about to throw his ostrich head at me. But knowing that that's not what's happening. And I think that what I suppose I'd say is that instead of taking away the idea of wonderment, that sense that I know that this is, Pompeii is reconstructed, and we're not going back to the ancient world, etc., etc. Instead of taking away my wonderment, it sort of increases it. It adds to this kind of, can you ever quite get there? No, you can't. Are they like us? No, they're not. Well, no, but they're not like us. And I find that an irresolvable and head-splitting problem. I think thinking about the ancient Romans is as kind of head-splitting and baffling as thinking about black holes or what infinity is. It's no more or less impossible to imagine. And I think that's why I like the MacNeice in a way, because I think it's that use of unimaginably. That's where my emphasis lies. But but I agree. I think it's a real problem. And as if you come next time, you'll discover I find the question of finding someone to identify with in the Greek or Roman world is about the most misleading thing you could possibly want to do, but sort of kind of wanting to be able for a minute just to feel like what Dio might have felt there. That's really exciting, but it's impossible excitement. I don't know. It's a sort of strange kind of eroticism to this, isn't there? I kind of feel as I talk about allure and this kind of, but that's what I think it is.
That's great. Let's have, a question is coming up online, but it's not quite finished, so let's go to one more question from the audience here.
Somebody had their hand up there.
Yes. Lindsay. Yeah, it's Lindsay. Here we are.
I use my classroom voice. To build on that last question then, what lost text from the classical world would you most like to recover from Alexandria that we don't have now?
Depends when you think Alexandria did burn down. That's a quite tricky one. I'm going to put the conflagration late. And I have an instant answer to that question, but it still fails the Lowry test. I mean, I'm going to say I want the autobiography of Agrippina, the mother of Nero. Right? You know, totally obvious. I'm not going to have the lost books of Tacitus. I love him, but we've got loads of them. We don't need any more. All fine. I will have Agrippina's autobiography in the sure and certain knowledge that it will be a terrible disappointment. You know, it is going to be so boring, and she's going to be so dutiful, and you know, in some ways, I'm going to think maybe I liked Agrippina better before I had the autobiography. You know, maybe the fantasy of Agrippina was better, but that is what I would certainly. I have no doubt. If anybody ever asked me that question, I give that answer because it's true.
All right, from our virtual audience, you compared cultural identity in the Roman world as a tangled knot. Could you talk about connectivity in the ancient world through the perspective of the underbelly rather than through literary sources?
I'm not quite sure what hangs on connectivity there, but I think that, yes, in all kinds of ways you can, and in a sense that's one of the things that I was wanting to do by going to the Pompeian Bar, that there you've got, it's not, I mean, I'm going to say this, I don't mean to, unmediated in about 5 inverted commas. There you're not seeing a literary presentation. You're seeing a barman's presentation to the bar customers. And I think underbelly, you know, you get more of an underbelly in literary sources than you think. I mean, you look at Phaedrus, for example, a fabulist, probably an ex-slave, not necessarily, but probably giving the perspective of the underdog in traditional fable style. Epictetus's philosophy certainly is an ex-slave with a very clear version of what the perspective of a slave is on the doings of the imperial court. But often it has to be through graffiti, through papyri in Roman Egypt, it's through letters, which we're not going to call, I think, literary texts from the soldiers at Vindolanda asking, you know, Hadrian's Wall fort, asking for woolly knickers and this kind of thing. You can reach this, and you can reach some things which are not literary texts. But it's always hard. I mean, I think that, no, put it this way, I now find that really interesting. I always have, and it is going back to the bit of cake. If somebody came to me and said, look, what I really, really want to do for my PhD is I want to do a subject about the perceptions of the Roman world by non-elite women in the Roman Empire, I would say choose another subject, because it's only going to be frustrating. You know? Now, that doesn't mean that all these things aren't very interesting, but you have to be aware of what the limitations are.
Lindsay, you had a question a moment ago, if we could have the...
Well, this has been so interesting, and I may be the only one who didn't know who the person is who told you that your work was true but boring. I would like to know.
I'll tell you now. It was Keith Hopkins. You know, that was one of the milder criticisms that he made of me in my career, but one of the more useful ones, right? But he, you know, even he had to, you know, we had to have a bottle of wine and a pizza before he kind of said, it's a bit dull. You know? And it's, you know, I think that stuck with me. That stuck with me as much as the damn cake, really. And, you know, like looking back now, I can see that I thought that when you wrote, or when you gave a paper, what you were doing that for was to explain your ideas. That was, you know, it was for you. I've got to get my ideas. Well, it's to somebody, guys, you know, somebody has got to be, you have to get into the way of having an audience that wants to hear about them. And you see that. I'm sorry, there's probably loads of graduate students in the audience. I'm going to be terribly now offensive. But, you know, I was the same. Graduate students give their first paper and they're doing like this, and they want to get all their damn ideas in, instead of saying, I want to interest my audience in what I do. And it takes a lot of bravery to get to that point, a lot of bravery. And I was pushed to it. Otherwise, you know, it would have taken me years and years, if ever, to get to that point.
Yes, there's a question here in the black and white striped shirt. Yes.
Hi, so thank you for the talk. You mentioned that the constructions of the people from Pompeii were constructions, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that. And also if you ever think that the constructions could be as valuable as originals?
I do. The last, I'll come to it, but I do. As long as you know what you're dealing with. It's only the deception. The stuff about these things being constructions, I only really discovered about 10 years ago when I was making a television program, and a producer had an idea of actually putting these things into a medical scanner and seeing what was inside. And as soon as you did that, it was clear that they'd been, well, not exactly faked up, but they were full of bricks and all kinds of things. And then when you kind of dug beneath the surface a bit, you discovered that this was largely when Fiorelli first discovered them in the 19th century, or first discovered how to make them. There was a huge desire to sentimentalize it. And so they were put together with people with whom they didn't belong. So you had the loving couple, etc., etc. Now, the basic technique that the dead bodies decomposed and left a vacuum is correct. And I hope that the ones made most recently don't fall into that problem. That who knows, you know. But certainly the famous ones that come, and the dog and stuff. The dog you got in the Museum of Science and Industry is about a 25th generation copy anyway. They never lent their original dog, you know. They just, you know, they make more dogs when they need them to send to the United States of America. Very sensible, but it's not the bloody dog, right? You know. And I think, in a way, I don't mind. You know, do I mind that Pompeii has been reconstructed? No, I'm pleased it has. I just wish somebody would say. That's all. You know, if you read the early 19th century accounts of, I'll be mostly British, some American travellers to Pompeii, they complain terribly about it. They say, this looks like it was a city, said one, recently destroyed by the French. Well, of course it looks like that. It's been destroyed by a volcano, right? And it wasn't until the late 19th century with the House of the Vettii that they decided that it would be much better, and better for conservation, to rebuild the walls and put a roof on. And I think, sensible idea. But just don't pretend to me. You sit there, and I've done recently mostly filming in Pompeii. That gives you a lot of time to overhear. This is why I snoop around Pompeii, listening to what people say. And people come and say, God, you wouldn't imagine that the roof survived, would you? And you think, am I going to say, excuse me? And you don't. You just think, just leave it. Yes.
We have a virtual question here, and then I'll come to Eric. Given the changes that have taken place over the years academically, if you were starting your classical studies now, where and how would you begin?
I probably wouldn't have the chance to. I mean, I did Latin and Greek, as I said, at high school, and that would be a very, very rare opportunity now. In the UK, in kind of academic girls' school like mine, you'd probably still do Latin. Greek would be probably not on the agenda. I think, and this is going to sound so old-fashioned as to be embarrassing, and please don't tweet about it, right? I think I still feel really, really grateful that I learnt, not always with total enjoyment, but I learnt Latin and Greek to what was a reasonably good standard. My Latin and Greek is nowhere near as good as some other people's, and I don't think that, apart from a bit of Homer and a bit of Herodotus, I don't think I'll ever be able to sit down and read a bit of Greek like I can read a bit of French. I just don't think that I'll ever be able to do that, and I'm not going to bother to invest the time now, I'm too old, right? But I feel utterly, utterly grateful that I can think about the ancient world from the linguistic inside. Now, that's not to say I think translations are a bad idea. I think they're a great idea, and I use them all the time. And anybody who says they never use a translation is lying, right? But the idea that sense that I can manipulate the language, I think, is really important. And I'd start back there. I don't know what else I'd do. I kind of feel it's all worked out okay. but
I think we'd all agree with that. Eric Slaughter?
Thank you so much. There's a subtle implication, or maybe not so subtle, in the talk that the scholarly world of the classics, or maybe of the humanities, is divided into heroic curators who open the glass and security guards lock you up. So
God. Thank you for pointing that out.
I want to know if that's right, and if you have advice for security guards, how they might be more like curators.
I think that I have to, confess, an interest here. I'm a trustee of the British Museum, so please, and I'm not speaking for the British Museum. I always get into trouble for this. I think that I can see why you think that, and I inadvertently, really, because of the cartoons and stuff. I think that security guards are hugely important, and actually they ought to be made more like curators. They ought actually to be encouraged to enjoy what they do. I was at the Frick recently, and I was just amazed, and I thought this must be a different regime of employment. The security guards were wonderful, actually. They were quite difficult. Frick have a no photography policy, and it's quite hard with mobile phones to enforce a no photography policy. They were doing it by engaging people extremely nicely, talking about the pictures, and I thought that's the kind of way you can actually use people on the ground in a much more constructive way. My bugbear, though, I think you're right, I have a bugbear. I have an enemy in this, but it's not the security guards. It's conservators. But, okay, but I'm thinking about real ones. But, I think most scholars probably want to be like my curator. They don't always know how to do it. I think that's... But it does relate to what I said about the kind of blue glovification of the past. And it's that element, it's the conservatorial element that I worry about. It's not that, any conservator here, I'm sorry about what I'm going to say. But I think the idea that has increased over the time I've had anything in any way professional to do with it, that somehow the past has to be protected from the present, that you're only allowed to touch anything if you sanitize yourself. Now, I think that is a really, really major enemy to sharing. And in the UK, it's been absolutely internalized. If ever on the television I touch something without a blue glove on, you can guarantee that I'll get dozens of emails saying, you should have been wearing a blue glove. You write back and you say, we always follow what we are asked to do in the museum concerned. But the idea that the past has become off limits for its own good, that is, I mean, I think that's what we ought to contest. I mean, in my own ex-faculty, in the 1960s, a whole collection of about 20 real crack Greek pots were bought, very cheaply, so that students could come along and know what it was like to handle a Greek pot, and it was always great fun. And if one broke, it didn't matter. There's lots of other crack Greek pots where that one came from. They're not that valuable, We've got plenty. We're not dealing with Ezekias here, They're now locked up behind glass, and they got out with bloody blue gloves. That's where that's my enemy, and I'll fight those buggers till the day. Right, you can turn a kid's life around, well, like mine was, by letting them get close to the past. Okay, you don't let them handle loads and loads of, leather shoes that are really, really fragile, but it's an awful lot. It doesn't matter. If it breaks, plenty more where that came from.
Well, these are wonderful thoughts, and thank you all.
I get into trouble about that. I really will.
Let me just invite you all to return next week on April 25th when Mary Beard discusses the shock of the old. She will ask us what is old or new about the classics, with a discussion that begins with the art of antiquity and advances to modern times. And we will finally learn what the word classics actually means. So we all look forward to this. Thank you so much, Mary.